A carriage climbs the frozen hill toward Ravenmoor Hall, its ancient stones shrouded in secrets deeper than the Somerset winter. Inside sits Ingrid Harwood, a governess haunted by scandal, entering a house where silence reigns and shadows whisper. Behind its locked doors waits a duke imprisoned by grief and a child who has lost her voice to sorrow. Soon choices must be made, between duty and desire, silence and truth, and the past that refuses to remain buried. Dear listener, welcome to a story where every secret has its price. Tell us, where in the world are you joining us from tonight? And what is it about historical romance that always captures your heart? Bath, England, winter of 1852. The sky above Somerset was the colour of ashes, thick with the promise of snow. The carriage wheels creaked beneath the weight of time and frost as they climbed the final hill that led to Ravenmoor Hall. Inside, Ingrid Harwood sat straight-backed, hands gloved and folded neatly over a worn leather satchel. Her breath fogged the glass, but she did not wipe it clean. She preferred the blur. Once, long ago, she had arrived at a grand house with her heart full of hope. Now she arrived with nothing but her name, a bundle of references too modest to impress, and a silence she had made her closest companion. Ravenmoor rose before her like something sculpted from grief itself. Its grey stone facade streaked with ivy and shadow, its windows tall and dark as closed eyes. The main doors were oak, weathered and iron-banded, and they groaned as they opened. No footman greeted her, no voices called out, only the cold. She stepped down without help, her boots crunching into the gravel. The carriage rolled away behind her, leaving her entirely alone. The woman who greeted her at the threshold was tall and square-shouldered, with grey eyes and a severe white cap tied tightly beneath her chin. Her black wool dress was spotless, her apron starched and creased like paper. A ring of keys jingled softly at her waist. "Mrs. Redgrave?" Ingrid asked, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. The woman gave a single nod. "You're expected. Follow me." No warmth, no welcome, just the turning of the shoulder and the sound of boots on stone. The hall was vast and bitterly cold. Tapestries hung like mourning veils. A single lantern flickered near the staircase, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. Ingrid's breath caught, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. This house did not echo with life. It remembered. Mrs. Redgrave spoke without turning. "You will not go near the West Wing. His Grace's instructions." "I understand," Ingrid replied softly, though her curiosity pricked. The housekeeper halted at a narrow door and opened it to a modest chamber. A fire had been lit, but just barely. The bed was narrow, the basin chipped, yet there was privacy and peace. "You'll find Miss Lillian in the morning nursery," Mrs. Redgrave said. "She does not speak, she does not tolerate touch. You are not here to fix her, you are here to keep her safe." She paused, eyes narrowing. "That is all." Ingrid bowed her head. "I understand." But that night, alone in the dim room, Ingrid did not sleep. She unpacked her meager belongings in silence, placing a small framed miniature, her late husband's portrait, on the bedside table. Then, seating herself at the window, she opened her journal and began to write. The house is grieving. Not just its master, not just the child. The very walls mourn. A clock struck 10. Wind howled against the shutters. Then a sound. Soft, shuffling, fabric against fabric. Small footsteps. She stood and opened the door slowly. There, in the corridor's weak light, stood the child. Lillian, 8 years old, pale as snow. Hair parted neatly down the center, 2 thin braids falling over her shoulders. Her nightdress was clean but wrinkled. Her doll, a muslin creature with faded buttons, clutched tightly to her chest. Her green eyes were wide, not afraid, not angry, but hollow, as if something vital had been blown out like a candle flame. Ingrid did not move. Lillian did not speak. The silence between them was absolute. Then Ingrid did something unexpected. She knelt by the open door, far enough not to startle, close enough to be seen. and she began to hum, a hymn from long ago, sung in a village church before shame had touched her name, before widowhood had narrowed her world. The child stood still. Ingrid's voice was low, careful, almost trembling. Lillian's fingers loosened around the doll, and then, so slight it might have been imagined, her head tilted, just a fraction, toward the sound. Ingrid closed her eyes, heart swelling with something she dared not name. Not yet, but it shimmered at the edge of hope. The child turned and vanished down the corridor without a word. Ingrid remained on her knees, the tune fading from her lips, and for the first time in years, she felt not quite alone. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, Ravenmore Hall remained silent, but the hush had changed. It was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence before something begins. Morning crept slowly into Ravenmore Hall, not with light but with the silver hush of snow. Outside, the world had softened beneath a veil of white. Inside, the house remained untouched by warmth. Fireplaces smoked but did not blaze. Lamps flickered but refused to brighten the endless shadows that clung to every carved panel and arching corridor. Ingrid Harwood rose before the servants stirred. The quiet had become her companion, less a void than a fabric she had learned to wear. She dressed by candlelight, slipping into her dark wool gown, fastening each button with measured care. The house was cold enough that her breath clouded in the mirror. She tied her fichu at the collar, pinned her hair into its usual braided coil, and stepped into the hall with the same solemnity one brings to a chapel. The stillness was immense. Every board beneath her feet groaned softly, as though disturbed after too long a slumber. She moved like a question through the great corridors, taking note of the dust that had settled in the corners, the tarnished sconces, the velvet drapes drawn tightly shut against the pale light of day. She had not yet met the Duke, not properly, but his presence hung over the house like a portrait without a frame, unseen yet undeniable. Ingrid's intention that morning was not to explore, but to acquaint herself with the estate's rhythm. She walked the gallery lined with ancestral portraits, each figure peering down with the disapproving solemnity of those who had never imagined their legacy would fall into quiet ruin. Past the library doors, past the conservatory sealed by frost, she moved without sound, as if to respect the mourning the house had never abandoned. Then she heard it. A sound barely perceptible, like fabric brushing against wood. Not from the stairs, not from the servants' wing. From behind a door unlike the others. It stood at the far end of the eastern corridor, narrow and tall, painted not in the soft ivory of the other thresholds, but in a muted blue, worn to grey where hands had once rested. A heavy brass lock sealed it shut. Dust rimmed the base. Mrs. Redgrave's voice echoed in memory. "You will not go near the west wing." Ingrid remained still. The sound did not return, and yet the air was charged, like the hush before thunder. She did not touch the door. She only stood before it, breathing the cold scent of stone and lavender gone dry. Something moved behind her. A draught? A trick of the senses. She turned. Nothing. Not even a mouse. Not even her own courage. Later that afternoon, she was led to the schoolroom. There Lillian sat by the window, her small hands curled into the folds of her skirt, her doll held tightly. The child did not speak. Ingrid, respecting the fragile distance between them, offered a gentle presence. She read aloud, not to teach, not to compel, but to surround them both with words that had outlived pain, stories of far-off places, of children brave enough to tame silence. Lillian did not look at her, but she did not run. When Ingrid finished reading, she placed a handkerchief on the table, embroidered with a single violet, a gift, unspoken. That evening, after supper taken alone and conversation scarce as snowdrops in frost, Ingrid returned to her room. The fire had been lit more generously this time. She removed her gloves, loosening her fingers from their stiff leather cage, and pulled the journal from beneath her pillow. Her pen scratched gently across the page. This house breathes differently at night. Like a cathedral long abandoned, a house where the air remembers too much. She paused, listening. It was not imagination. Steps, not down the hall, not in the servants' corridor. Above her, bare feet, slow and steady. The wood creaked as though startled by contact. Then, whispers, not a conversation, a murmur. She rose, heart beating in her ears. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she opened her door and stepped into the corridor. Her candle's flame danced against the walls, casting long, wavery shadows. At the top of the grand staircase stood a man, tall, barefoot, clothed in a dark dressing robe. He faced the locked door, the same one from that morning. His hand rested gently against the panel, as if he expected it to open at the sound of his breath. He was speaking. Ingrid could not hear the words, only the cadence, low, broken, as if the sentences came not from the present, but from some memory repeating itself. She did not move. The candlelight revealed him partially, just enough to glimpse the weariness in his posture, the grey at his temples, the scar that ran faintly from his brow to his temple like a forgotten path. The Duke of Ashbury. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge her, and yet she felt that he knew she was there. A gust of cold wind slipped down the corridor. Her candle flickered. She held it steady. When he finally stepped back from the door, his shoulders sagged with a sorrow that belonged to no single night. He walked away, past her, without meeting her eyes. But as he passed, something in her shifted. It was not pity, nor fascination. It was a recognition of grief so deep it refused to be buried, of silence too old to break with sound. Back in her room, Ingrid relit the candle and sat by the fire. She did not write again that night. She did not need to. The house had spoken, not in words, but in echoes. The wind rattled the high windows of Ravenmore Hall as if trying to awaken something long dormant. The grey light of morning spilled through narrow panes like diluted ink across cold stone floors. Ingrid Harwood moved through the household with measured purpose, her every step echoing softly in the stillness. Yet today, there was a different current in the air, tense, uncertain, as if the walls themselves were waiting. She descended to the schoolroom with her usual composure, her shawl drawn neatly over her shoulders, her hair secured in its braided twist. The child was already there, sitting by the frosted window, her small hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. Lillian had not spoken, not once, not even in sleep, but there were other languages a child might use. Silence, after all, could be fluent. Ingrid greeted her as always, with warmth unforced and gentleness free of demand. She took a seat at the corner of the table and began the morning's lesson, her voice clear but quiet, letting the words of fables and arithmetic roll into the stillness like smooth stones into water. And then it happened. So small a gesture, and yet it made the breath catch in Ingrid's throat. As she leaned forward to retrieve a dropped pencil, she felt the soft tug at her side. Not painful, not harsh, gentle, curious. Lillian was braiding a lock of her hair. The child had crept from her seat and now stood beside Ingrid, her fingers weaving the strands with unsteady focus. Her eyes remained downcast, her doll tucked into the crook of her elbow, but her hands moved with slow concentration, as though performing a rite remembered only in dreams. Ingrid did not move. She barely breathed. She allowed the silence to hold them both, let the moment unfold without question or fear. And when the braid was done, Lillian stepped back. She said nothing. She did not smile. She simply returned to her seat and resumed her vigil at the window. Ingrid lowered her eyes to the table, her heart thudding with something far deeper than triumph. It was trust, or its beginning. That afternoon, the snow fell heavier. Ingrid returned to her chambers early, pausing in the library only to retrieve a volume of poetry, an indulgence she permitted herself when the weight of memory pressed too sharply. She was nearly at her door when a voice, smooth and cold, cut through the hush like a blade. "You seem very comfortable in this house for someone who does not belong here." Ingrid turned. He stood at the end of the corridor, Sebastian Greystoke, the Duke of Ashbury. His presence filled the space before he even stepped forward. The long black coat hung open over his waistcoat, and his gloved hands were clasped behind his back. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, held the quiet fury of a man who had been interrupted not in action, but in grief. Ingrid straightened. "Your Grace, you were in the West Corridor," he said without warmth. "Twice." She inclined her head. "I did not trespass. I stopped before the door. And you watched me," he added, his voice low and deliberate, "while I stood before it." "I did." He approached now, slow but purposeful. "Do you make a habit of observing your employers in private rituals?" Ingrid met his gaze with calm strength. "No, but grief observed is not a sin, Your Grace. It is simply human." He flinched, almost imperceptibly. "I brought you here to instruct the child," he said tightly, "not to study me. I am not studying you. Then do not presume to understand." Ingrid's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I presume nothing. But silence does not mean blindness, just as grief does not excuse cruelty." For a moment the corridor seemed to hold its breath. Sebastian's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in scrutiny, as if seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. "You are not what I expected," he murmured. "I seldom am," she replied. He said nothing more, only turned and vanished into the shadows of the corridor. That night, after the child had gone to bed and the fire in the schoolroom had dulled to a faint orange flicker, Ingrid returned to tidy the lesson books. The room smelled faintly of chalk and lavender oil. She gathered the papers, stacked the pencils, and reached for Lillian's worn copybook. Inside, folded between 2 pages, was a note, small, plain, no seal, no flourish. She unfolded it slowly. "You are not alone." Her breath caught. She stared at the words for a long moment, then looked toward the door, half expecting a figure to emerge from the dark. But the hall was empty. She brought the note to her room and placed it beneath her lamp. The handwriting was masculine, elegant, slanted, deliberate. Not childish, not from a servant. She thought of Mrs. Redgrave, but dismissed the notion. She thought of him. The next morning, she passed the Duke in the lower corridor. He said nothing. Neither did she. But as she stepped past him, she glanced briefly upward and caught it, a flicker in his eyes. Recognition. He knew. She paused. "Thank you for the note." He did not answer, but something in his posture shifted. His hand brushed the brass railing as if steadying himself. He looked away, and for the first time, Ingrid saw something in the Duke of Ashbury that unsettled her more than anger, more than sorrow. It was vulnerability, a wound not healed, not scarred, still open. And in that moment, she understood that this house, for all its grandeur, was not ruled by pride or nobility. It was ruled by pain. And he, the man within it, was not a tyrant. He was simply broken, but not beyond mending. Not yet. The frost that morning clung like lace to the windows of Ravenmore Hall, etching delicate white veins across the panes, as if nature herself had taken up embroidery. Inside, the hearths fought bravely against the chill, but the cold had seeped into the bones of the house long before the first snowfall of the season. It was a cold of memory, of time paused in mourning. And yet, as Ingrid Harwood folded the child's shawl and set her books in order, she sensed a tremor in the stillness. Something had shifted. It arrived in a thick ivory envelope, sealed with crimson wax bearing the crest of the Ashcombe family. The script on the front, elegant and assured, was addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Ashbury. Mrs. Redgrave handed the letter to Sebastian herself, her expression unreadable. He read it in silence at the breakfast table, the firelight catching the silver threads at his temple. Lillian sat to his right, her eyes focused on her untouched toast, her fingers slowly unraveling the hem of her sleeve. When he reached the end, he placed the letter face down on the table, his jaw tense. Mrs. Redgrave waited. "Will you respond, Your Grace?" "No," he said simply. "We will not attend." Her brow lifted by the faintest degree. It is Lady Ashcombe's charity ball. The entire county will be present, and the girl has not been seen in society since before. The pause was delicate but heavy. Sebastian rose from the table without another word and left the room. Ingrid, who had observed this exchange with careful detachment, continued to butter a slice of bread for Lillian. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and even. "Who is Lady Ashcombe?" Mrs. Redgrave glanced at her. His Grace's cousin, widowed twice, fashionable but not unkind. She hosted the last ball the Duchess ever attended. The silence that followed was long. Later that afternoon, as snow began to fall again in slow, soundless spirals, Mrs. Redgrave entered Ingrid's room holding a small package wrapped in muslin. "Lady Ashcombe sent this," she said, placing it on the bed. She expected the Duke would refuse, but she also knows him well enough to be prepared. Ingrid looked at the parcel, but did not move to touch it. "He's changed," Mrs. Redgrave added, her voice gruff but honest. "Since you arrived, since the child began to braid your hair and follow you like a shadow. He still believes himself unfit to walk among the living, but he's begun to glance toward the light." "What is this, then?" Ingrid asked softly, eyes on the parcel. "A gown and an invitation." The next morning, Sebastian entered the schoolroom. Lillian immediately lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around her doll. Ingrid, seated at the table correcting an arithmetic exercise, stood slowly. "You will attend the ball," he said without preamble, as the child's chaperone. The silence between them deepened, not from shock, from the sheer weight of what his words implied. "Very well," Ingrid replied, "if that is your wish." He hesitated, just long enough for her to notice. "It is not a wish, it is a necessity. Then I shall dress accordingly." And he left. The gown was a marvel of simplicity. Slate blue silk with a high waist and a modest square neckline, trimmed with satin ribbon and delicate seed pearls at the sleeves. It was elegant without being ostentatious, and the fabric felt foreign beneath Ingrid's fingers. Soft, fluid, not meant for governesses or widows. She stood before the mirror in the dim light of her bedchamber, her hair styled in a low, coiled chignon, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the ribbon at her throat. When she descended the staircase that evening, time seemed to pause. The grand hall, usually so hollow, glowed with candlelight. A carriage waited beyond the frosted glass doors. Lillian stood near the entry, her gown a pale green, her small gloved hands folded before her. Sebastian turned from the window. For a long moment he said nothing. His gaze traveled from the satin trim at her hem to the single pin in her hair, an old pearl comb Ingrid had almost left behind in London. There was something in his eyes, not approval, not desire, but recognition. "You'll do," he said quietly, and offered her his arm. The ball was held at Ashcombe House, a gilded estate of polished wood and mirrored walls. The hall glittered with chandeliers, each one 1,000 tiny flames dancing above heads, powdered and perfumed. Musicians played beneath a velvet-draped gallery. Laughter swirled among the guests like perfume, bright, brittle, and unceasing. Ingrid moved through it like a shadow in silk. She kept to the edges, as a proper chaperone should. She watched Lillian from a respectful distance, standing silently near a table of lemonade and cordial glasses, her fingers clasped tightly behind her back. The child did not cry, she did not hide, she simply was, still and solemn like a painting hung too high to reach. Whispers followed Ingrid through the crowd like a second gown, murmured judgments, half-covered glances. They did not say her name. They did not have to. "She's the governess, isn't she? Imagine, brought here by him, the poor Duchess would faint." And then, Lady Ashcombe, tall, regal, clad in burgundy taffeta. She approached with a practiced smile and kissed Ingrid lightly on the cheek. "You wear it beautifully," she said, her voice silky. He never did understand how silence breeds scandal more quickly than confession. Before Ingrid could reply, the orchestra shifted. A waltz, and there, through the crush of guests, Sebastian appeared again. He crossed the floor with quiet command, and when he reached Ingrid, He extended his hand. "For appearance," he said. She hesitated. Then she placed her gloved hand in his. They moved together with an elegance neither expected. His hand pressed firmly at her back. Her other hand rested lightly in his. The music flowed between them, but it was not the notes that stirred the breath between their lips. It was closeness, rare, charged, and precarious. They did not speak, but their eyes locked more than once. A single breath shared too near the cheek, a brush of his thumb along her glove, the faintest tightening of her fingers when he spun her. When the dance ended, applause rose, and then, quietly, unexpectedly, a voice behind her. An older woman, her expression worn with time and bitterness, leaned close. "That house," she whispered, "ruins women." Ingrid turned, but the woman was gone. Back at Ravenmore Hall, long after the fire had died and the night had deepened, Ingrid stood at her window. She had been danced with by a man who did not smile. She had been watched by people who whispered behind fans. She had worn silk when cotton would have sufficed, and still, the echo of his voice lingered. "You'll do." But what had she become in his eyes? And more frightening still, what was he becoming in hers? The storm arrived as dusk fell, sweeping across the hills like a mournful hymn, its voice howling through the trees and battering against the stone walls of Ravenmore Hall. The wind clawed at the shutters, the rain struck the windows in frantic rhythm, and the great house groaned under the weight of memories it could no longer contain. Ingrid Harwood sat alone in the schoolroom, the hearth at her side barely holding its flame, her needle frozen halfway through a hem she had been repairing since morning. The room flickered with golden lamplight, yet nothing about it felt warm. It was as though the walls themselves held their breath, listening for footsteps that belonged to another time. Outside, thunder rolled like the growl of a wounded beast. Inside, the wind found the seams of the house, the cracks in the window panes, the gaps under ancient doors, and whispered through them with voices that sounded almost human. Lillian had gone to bed early, curled beneath woolen blankets, her doll clutched to her chest. Ingrid had sung to her, not a lullaby, but a hymn she barely remembered learning, one sung by her own mother in a life that now felt like a book left out in the rain. The child hadn't spoken, but her small hand had found Ingrid's sleeve as sleep claimed her. It was a tether, slight but present. Now, with the girl asleep and the storm thrashing like a jealous spirit beyond the glass, Ingrid rose. The thread in her hand fell forgotten. Something unseen but felt pulled her from the schoolroom and into the corridor. The candle in her hand flickered wildly, its flames struggling to survive the draughts that danced along the ancient stone. She walked without aim, or perhaps with purpose, too deeply buried for her to name. The west wing had remained untouched since the first day. Its silence was deeper, its cold sharper. She had not gone beyond its threshold, not by order, but by instinct. The air near it always seemed too still, too heavy, like standing at the edge of a grave whose occupant had not been entirely laid to rest. But tonight, the storm had other intentions. As she passed the last bend in the corridor, a violent gust forced its way through the window at the end of the hall, bursting it open with a shriek. Wind rushed in, sweeping past her skirts, and with it, the heavy door to the west wing swung open. The sound it made was not a creak, it was a cry. Ingrid stood frozen, her candlelight barely illuminating the threshold. Beyond it, darkness reigned, velvet and oppressive like the hush of a church long abandoned. She stepped forward. The hallway beyond was lined with faded portraits, their faces barely visible beneath dust. The carpet was soft beneath her boots, muffling her movements. At the end, a second door waited, white-painted, with a rose carved into its panel. She pushed it open. The room was still, the Duchess's chambers. Time had not dared touch this place. The curtains were drawn, but moonlight filtered through the storm-lit sky, casting silver across the room's forgotten treasures. A cradle sat by the hearth, its coverlet pale as milk. A music box rested on a side table, open, silent. A dressing table bore scattered hairpins and a silver-backed brush. On the bed, a nightgown had been folded neatly. never worn. The scent of lavender lingered, faint but unyielding. Ingrid did not speak. She did not breathe for a long moment. She simply looked at the memories preserved in lace and linen, at the love and despair sewn into every corner of the room. And then, the door behind her slammed shut. She turned. Sebastian stood in the threshold, rain dripping from his shoulders, his coat clinging to him like a second skin. His eyes were wild, not with fury, but something far more dangerous. "Get out," he said. Ingrid did not move. His voice broke. "I said get out." She took a step toward him. "I didn't mean to intrude. The wind, you had no right." Her voice remained calm. "Then punish me. But I will not pretend this room doesn't exist. I will not pretend she didn't." At that, he staggered back, as if struck. His hands clenched at his sides. "You think I want to forget? I think you've been trying to," she said quietly. "And failing." His chest heaved. She was everything this house needed. And I was away, playing soldier, writing letters that arrived too late. I wasn't here. He turned from her, gripping the doorframe with white-knuckled hands. The child came early. The birth went wrong. The baby, he didn't survive. And neither did she. Not really, not for long. Ingrid swallowed, the ache in her throat rising like floodwater. "She took her own life," Sebastian said, each word like iron. "She locked herself in this room wearing that gown. She drank from a vial I had hidden in the study. I never found out how she knew." The wind howled through the broken window. The cradle creaked softly, as if moved by breath. "I wasn't here," he repeated, his voice a rasp now. "I wasn't here when they needed me. I came back to a corpse and a child who wouldn't speak." Ingrid stepped forward, but he raised a hand. "Don't pity me." "I don't," she said. "I see you." Their eyes met then, truly met, and in that instant all pretenses collapsed. The walls of title and duty, grief and guilt gave way to something rawer, something human. Sebastian turned away and walked into the corridor, his steps slow and uneven. Ingrid watched him go. She remained for a moment longer, the candlelight trembling in her grasp. Then she turned, gently closing the door behind her. Later that night, after the storm had calmed and the house exhaled its sorrow into the silence, Ingrid stepped out of her room once more. The corridor was dim, the sconces nearly extinguished. She found him on the floor outside the nursery, curled like a man too tired to continue pretending. His head rested against the doorframe. His eyes were closed. Rain still clung to the ends of his hair. His boots were soaked, and his coat lay like armor abandoned in battle. She said nothing, only fetched a blanket from the linen closet and returned. With careful hands, she draped it over his shoulders. He stirred, but did not wake. For a long moment she stood beside him, watching the man beneath the title, the boy beneath the war, the father beneath the grief. Then she turned and left him there, wrapped not only in wool, but in something far more fragile: mercy. The frost clung longer to the windows that morning. It did not melt with the dawn, nor retreat beneath the timid sunlight that fell over the hills of Somerset. It remained, like memory, beautiful, brittle, and unyielding. Ravenmore Hall, though still wrapped in its quiet solemnity, had changed in ways almost imperceptible. A blanket folded at the edge of a chair, a fire kindled before dusk, a child's hum trailing down the corridor before silence returned. Small things, tender things. And yet they made the old house feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where something almost alive waited to breathe again. Ingrid Harwood stood at the tall window of the schoolroom, her hand resting on the glass, her breath clouding the pane in soft bursts. Behind her, Lillian practiced her letters at the desk, her small frame hunched in concentration, her tongue peeking out ever so slightly in the seriousness of her task. The child had not yet spoken, but she had begun to hum. She followed Ingrid with her eyes now, and once, just once, had rested her hand atop hers, wordless and fleeting. Ingrid would never speak of that moment, not to anyone, but she had tucked it away like a secret ribbon, worn close to the heart. That morning, as the girl scribbled and the governess watched the clouds gather, a knock echoed through the corridor. Firm, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Ingrid turned. Footsteps approached. Mrs. Redgrave appeared at the doorway, her face more rigid than usual, her mouth drawn in a line carved by tension. "There is a visitor," she said. "The Bishop of St. Michael's." Ingrid did not speak, but her hand withdrew from the glass. She knew. Before his name was uttered, before the footsteps reached the hall, she had felt the cold rise, not from the window, but from memory. Bishop Lionel Fairfax. He had arrived. The sitting room had been lit with care. The fire burned modestly. The silver tea service had been laid with hands that trembled more than they let on. And in the center of it all sat the bishop, tall and thin, wrapped in black wool and smug righteousness. His clerical collar gleamed against the somber fabric, and the heavy gold ring on his finger glinted each time he lifted his hand to adjust his coat. His hair had thinned further, and his features were more angular than Ingrid remembered, but his eyes remained unchanged, pale, watchful and cruel in their precision. Sebastian stood near the hearth, his expression impassive. It was a mask Ingrid had come to recognize, one he wore when the world intruded upon his grief. Ingrid entered the room, her posture calm, her breath carefully measured. Her eyes met the bishop's without hesitation. He rose. "Miss Harwood," he said, his voice drenched in false warmth. "It has been many years." "Not long enough," she replied evenly. A flicker passed through Fairfax's eyes, but he composed himself quickly. "I was passing through Bath and felt compelled to pay a visit to one of the county's most respected houses. A house, I fear now, the center of many unfortunate rumors." Sebastian said nothing. Ingrid remained still. The bishop continued, turning toward the duke. "Your Grace, forgive my candor, but I have heard troubling whispers from the local parishioners, concerns about the moral propriety of certain arrangements within this house. A governess granted unusual freedoms, a child left in the care of a woman whose past has been, let us say, colorful." "I believe," Sebastian said coldly, "that the color of one's past is of little consequence when weighed against their present integrity." The bishop smiled thinly. A noble sentiment, to be sure, but not always wise in practice. He turned back to Ingrid. "Miss Harwood, you once served in a most distinguished household in Sussex, until, of course, your sudden departure. A scandal, if I recall. Unconfirmed, of course. But the stain of scandal is rarely washed away with time." Ingrid's voice was calm, but it carried steel. "You know very well there was no scandal, only slander." Fairfax's smile sharpened. "A rejected offer of marriage is not slander, Miss Harwood. It is disappointment, which some, perhaps, are not bred to handle." Sebastian's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. "May I speak to Miss Harwood alone?" the bishop asked smoothly. "For old time's sake." The duke hesitated, then nodded once. "If Miss Harwood consents." She did. When the door closed behind Sebastian, the air thickened. Fairfax turned slowly. "You've done well for yourself, better than I expected. I wonder, what does the Duke see in you? Pity, curiosity, or simply something convenient?" "I serve his household," Ingrid replied. "Nothing more." "But that's not what they say, is it?" he murmured. "They say you've bewitched him, that Ravenmore's widowed master has taken to staring at the help. A scandal waiting to ignite." She did not flinch. He stepped closer. "You should leave, quietly. No one need know why. It's not too late to protect what little dignity you've managed to salvage." "I will not run," she said. He leaned in, his voice low, oily. "Then I will see to it that the child is removed from this house. The church can claim guardianship. A home like this is no place for a fragile girl, not with ghosts roaming the corridors and governesses roaming the bedchambers." Her breath caught, not in fear, but in fury. "You would tear her from her only shelter? I would do what is necessary, for her soul, for yours." He took a step back, adjusting his coat. "She's not the first woman this house has consumed. You are merely the next widow Ravenmore will swallow." The words landed like a curse, not shouted but whispered, precise. And then he left. Ingrid remained alone in the parlor, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart pounding not from fear, but from something older. righteousness, rage. That night, as the wind picked up once more and the snow returned to veil the hills, Ingrid stood at Lilian's bedside. The child slept peacefully, her doll tucked beneath her arm, her breath even. Ingrid leaned down, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. "I will not let them take you," she whispered. "No one will take you." Outside, the storm grew louder, but inside, Ingrid stood firm, and the house, long silent, seemed to listen. The days had grown longer, though not warmer. The frost no longer lingered past midday, and the crocuses dared timidly to show their colors through the brittle grass along the garden paths. But Ravenmoor remained caught in its own season, one not dictated by the calendar, but by silence, by memory, by the hush that lives between mourning and forgiveness. Within those walls, something had begun to change. Lilian now hummed as she worked. The melodies were soft, broken, tentative, but they came from her, not from mimicry or suggestion. Her small hands no longer trembled as she traced the letters on the slate, and once, when Ingrid corrected her gently, she had smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes. A flicker, a beginning. Ingrid had said nothing. She had only smiled back. And the house, so long accustomed to the rhythm of footfalls and whispers, had begun to adapt to a new sound, the sound of care, of healing. Fragile, yes, but present. It was on such a day, with the sky a flat, pale grey, and the air holding that strange tension between winter's farewell and spring's approach, that Sebastian Greystoke entered the schoolroom unannounced. Ingrid rose, smoothing her skirt instinctively. Lilian looked up from her writing, her pencil paused mid-stroke, her green eyes curious. Sebastian carried a small leather-bound volume in one hand, its edges worn, the spine lovingly mended. Without a word, he offered it to Ingrid. She accepted it cautiously, her fingers brushing his glove, the Sonnets of Nightingale Vale, a collection of verses, delicate and profound. She opened the cover and gasped softly. On the inside page, in ink faded to sepia, was a name, Margaret Greystoke. Below it a note penned in a different hand. For those who remember not with sorrow, but with a longing still alive. M. Ingrid's voice trembled. "Your mother?" He nodded. She kept it by her bedside until the end. She ran her hand gently over the inscription. "It's beautiful. She believed that grief," he said, his voice low, "should be allowed to linger, not as punishment, but as proof that something was once cherished." Ingrid looked up at him, their eyes locked. There was no fire between them, only the warmth of recognition, of something unspoken but deeply felt. "Thank you," she said softly. He inclined his head, and without another word, turned and left. But the silence he left behind was not emptiness, it pulsed. That afternoon, the clouds grew heavier, and the wind picked up in brief gusts that rattled the panes and stirred the ivy on the outer walls. Lilian had returned to her nap, her doll tucked neatly beneath her arm. Mrs. Redgrave busied herself in the linen rooms. Ingrid found herself drawn to the gardens. Though still bare of blossoms, they held a quiet dignity. The old hedges standing tall, the gravel paths brushed free of debris by unseen hands. She walked slowly, arms crossed against the chill, her thoughts too loud to still. Sebastian joined her without fanfare. She felt him before she saw him. His steps were distinctive, measured, certain. She turned and saw him approaching from the southern path, his coat drawn close, a scarf wrapped neatly at his neck. There was a softness to his expression that unsettled her more than any storm could. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the path beside her. She nodded. They walked together in silence for several paces, their breath visible in the crisp air, their steps in rhythm. Then he spoke. "There are days when I fear I have forgotten the sound of her voice." Ingrid looked at him, startled. Sebastian did not meet her gaze. Not just Eleanor's, my mother's, my child's cry, even my own laughter. It is as though the house has absorbed all sound and left only the echo. Ingrid said nothing. He stopped, turning toward the hedge. "I thought silence would be peace," he murmured, "but it has only become louder." Her gloved hand resting at her side brushed against his sleeve, not deliberately, a shift of movement, a crossing of lines. He flinched, not in revulsion, in surprise. Their eyes met once more, and something passed between them. Not desire, not yet, but its shadow. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the supper dishes cleared, Mrs. Redgrave lingered outside the schoolroom door, a folded shawl in her hands. She had come to offer it to Ingrid, who often stayed late correcting Lillian's lessons. But as she approached, she heard something, a whisper, faint, nearly imperceptible. "Miss Harwood sings like Mama." The housekeeper froze. Inside, the child sat at the table, her head bent, her voice a breath. Ingrid did not react with surprise or alarm. She only reached for the girl's hand, covering it gently with her own. Mrs. Redgrave stepped back into the shadows. The next morning, she brought Ingrid her tea herself, and said nothing about it. But in the village, the quiet peace beginning to settle over Ravenmoor was not reflected in the words that passed from mouth to mouth, at the bakery, in the pews, on the lips of widows too long idle. "The governess has bewitched the Duke. They say he walks with her, alone. She dines at the same table now, does she not? The child speaks, but only to her." And somewhere in a drawing room perfumed with envy, a letter was written, not with ink, but with poison. Back at Ravenmoor, Ingrid returned to her chamber late that night. The book of sonnets rested on her bedside table, opened to a verse she had read aloud by candlelight. "There are silences that speak more boldly than confession, and eyes that plead more deeply than prayer." She closed the book and extinguished the flame, but the warmth in her chest remained, a dangerous warmth, a dangerous affection. The first whisper came in the form of a folded newspaper left on the tray beside Sebastian's morning tea. Its headline, printed in bold ink-black letters, stretched across the page like a blade drawn in public. "Household tragedy at Ravenmoor. Is history repeating?" It was not sent directly. It did not need to be. The scandal was left to spread like frost over glass, quiet, cold, and impossible to ignore. Sebastian read the article in silence, his fingers tightening around the paper as each word carved deeper into the hollow that grief had already made inside him. The piece dripped with carefully constructed insinuation. An unnamed source. An intimate friend of the late Duchess. Hints of impropriety between master and governess. A child's mysterious silence. A house once struck by tragedy, now seemingly poised to repeat it. The worst were the last two lines. She arrived alone. She may yet leave the same way, but this time not by death, but disgrace. He did not speak for several minutes. Then he stood. The fire still crackled in the grate. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains with deceptive gentleness. And yet the air had shifted, colder than snow, heavier than thunder. In the schoolroom, Ingrid sensed it before she saw him. Sebastian entered without knocking, his expression unreadable, but his presence louder than any voice could be. Lillian sat by the window, her book open, her pencil idle. She looked up, and something in her face tensed. Ingrid rose. "Your Grace!" He held up a hand. "Come with me." She followed without protest, her heart pounding. Down the corridor, past the library, into the drawing room where the newspaper waited, unfolded, like a confession. He said nothing at first, only gestured toward it. Ingrid stepped closer, read the headline, and as her eyes scanned the paragraphs, she felt the blood drain from her face. Not because the words were true, but because they had been designed to wound. The bishop's hand was not on the page, but his voice was unmistakable. When she looked back at Sebastian, he was already watching her. "Is there anything," he asked, his voice hoarse, "in these pages that you believe to be true?" "No," she said. Her voice did not tremble. "Nothing but the cruelty of a man who once tried to own me." His jaw clenched. He turned toward the fire, bracing one hand against the mantel. "I brought you here for Lillian, and now, because of me, your name is once again dragged through mud." He paused, then added more quietly, "You deserve peace, not this, not whispers and stares. I have known worse, Ingrid replied. I know, he said, and that's what makes this unforgivable. She stepped closer. I am not afraid. You should be, he said, spinning around. This house, we will destroy whatever dares to grow in the cracks. She met his gaze without flinching. What is growing here is not danger. It is something you have not allowed in for years. Hope? He said bitterly. Love, she replied. Not scandal, not seduction, not the poison they're spreading in their parlors. For the briefest moment, he softened, and then, just as quickly, he pulled away again. You should go, he said. Leave before the rest of the county finishes what Fairfax has begun. She stepped back, as if struck. So that you may protect your name? She asked. No, he said, shaking his head. So I may protect you. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ingrid lowered her eyes, nodded once, and left the room. She packed slowly. There was little to take. A few books, the journal she kept tucked beneath her pillow, a shawl, a photograph of her mother worn at the edges. But before she left, she took one final walk. The west wing door was open. She had not entered since the storm. The air inside was still and solemn, like a chapel long untouched. She stepped into the nursery. The cradle had been dusted, the curtains tied back. Someone, Mrs. Redgrave perhaps, had lit the fire and left fresh lavender on the mantel. Ingrid stood in the center of the room, wrapped in silence. She pulled her shawl from her shoulders and folded it carefully, placing it inside the cradle. Then she retrieved a piece of paper from her coat and a pencil from her satchel. With careful hand, she wrote a single line. Speak, little one. There is love still in this house. She placed the note beside the shawl, then turned and walked away. She did not pause at the threshold. She did not look back. The snow had begun to fall again when she descended the steps of Ravenmore Hall. Not a storm, not a flurry, just a soft, steady fall like the world exhaling through tears. She pulled her coat tight around her and began to walk, not toward the road, but toward whatever came next. Behind her, the great house stood silent, but somewhere deep within its walls, something stirred, something too tender for words, too fierce for silence. And far above, in a window that had long remained closed, a curtain moved. The storm had returned to Somerset, not with rain this time, but with snow, sharp and relentless, falling in thick diagonal lines across the fields and roads like a curtain drawn across the world. Ravenmore Hall stood defiant beneath the weight of it, its chimneys smoking against a sky the color of lead, its windows glowing faintly with the promise of warmth that no one within seemed to feel. Inside the house, the fire in the drawing room blazed high, casting frantic shadows across the walls. Mrs. Redgrave stood before it, her hands clenched tightly around a folded piece of parchment. Her eyes, usually so composed, so immovable, were brighter than usual, edged with something that trembled between fury and sorrow. Sebastian Greystoke stood near the window, watching the storm rage across the moorland. He had not spoken in some time. Since Ingrid's departure, the days had passed not with hours, but with silences, each one heavier than the last. The halls felt emptier now, as though they were not merely missing a governess, but something vital, something living. She wrote to him, Mrs. Redgrave said at last, her voice hoarse. Weeks before her death. Sebastian turned. Slowly. Mrs. Redgrave extended the letter toward him. Your wife, Eleanor. He approached, took the parchment in hands that shook, though he would never admit it. The letter was folded once, the seal already broken. The paper had yellowed at the edges, the ink smudged in one corner as though a tear had touched it long ago. He read the first lines, and his breath caught. To Bishop Lionel Fairfax, I write not to confess, but to ask. I am weary of your counsel, of your visits, of your sermons that speak more of judgment than grace. I ask to be released from your care. Your guidance no longer comforts me. It frightens me. I fear the silence you impose has become heavier than the sorrow I carry. The letter ended abruptly. No signature, only the faintest trace of a blot where the ink had pooled. She gave it to me to send. Mrs. Redgrave murmured. But he came that afternoon, unannounced, and I did not know what to do. She was afraid of him, but she would not say why. I thought perhaps it was her grief talking. I buried the letter in the lining of her old chest. Sebastian's hands tightened around the paper. You should have brought this to me sooner. I should have done many things, the housekeeper said, but I did not, and she died believing herself unheard. He lowered his head. I have failed too many women in this house, he whispered. Mrs. Redgrave approached him, her voice softer now. Then do not fail another. He looked up. The snow had grown heavier, blanketing the land in a shroud of white. That afternoon, word arrived of a service being held at the cathedral, a public sermon led by Bishop Fairfax. The theme was repentance. The guest list was as long as the bishop's pride. Sebastian dressed in silence, black coat, black gloves, a silver pin at his collar, the one his father had worn to Parliament. Outside, the blizzard raged, but within him, something colder moved. The cathedral was full by the time he arrived. Light from tall, stained-glass windows cast ribbons of color across the pews, the stone floor, the bowed heads of the congregation. Bishop Fairfax stood tall in the pulpit, his voice rising with the cadence of rehearsed righteousness. He did not see Sebastian enter. He saw him only when the Duke stepped forward, walking down the central aisle with the weight of a man who had come not to pray, but to unbury the truth. Your Grace, Fairfax said, faltering, this is unexpected. Sebastian's voice rang out, steady and clear. A house cannot grieve in peace when wolves disguise themselves in cloth. Gasps echoed through the cathedral. Fairfax paled. Sebastian raised the letter. This was written by my wife, Eleanor, to the man who stood at her bedside not as comfort, but as jailer. She feared you. She asked to be freed from your moral counseling. And within days, she was dead. Whispers broke into murmurs. The bishop attempted to respond, but his words caught in his throat. You twisted her guilt into shame. You preyed on her isolation. And now you dare to speak of repentance in a hall filled with those who trusted you. Sebastian stepped closer to the pulpit. My house has mourned in silence for too long. I will no longer allow its memory to be defiled by a man unworthy of his robe. The bishop's voice, when it returned, was thin. This is blasphemy. This, Sebastian said, eyes burning, is justice. He did not stay for the end of the sermon, nor for the whispers that rose like smoke through the pews. He walked from the cathedral as snow blew in swirls around his boots. By the time he reached the stables at Ravenmoor, the sky was nearly dark. He mounted without assistance and rode into the storm. He did not need directions. He knew where she had gone. The boarding house stood near the edge of Bath, its shutters closed tight against the snow, its windows lit only by oil lamps. The wind screamed as he dismounted and approached the door. His coat was soaked, his gloves stiff with cold. The landlady opened the door, cautiously. Ingrid Harwood, he said. Is she here? The woman nodded. Third room on the left. He climbed the narrow stairs, each step a prayer he did not know how to form. At her door, he hesitated. Then he knocked. She opened it slowly. She wore a wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her hair undone and braided loosely down her back. Her eyes were rimmed with fatigue, but they did not waver when she met his gaze. You shouldn't be here, she said. I had to come. I read the article, she said, her voice flat. I know what it cost you. I don't care what it cost me, he said. Only what it cost you. She stepped aside, allowing him in. The room was modest. A fire burned low in the hearth. A journal rested on the bedside table, its pages open. He noticed it. He recognized the handwriting, his own words transcribed on the page. You are not alone. She followed his gaze. It was you. He nodded. A silence passed. I did not leave because of the article, she said. I left because you asked me to. I was wrong. You were grieving a woman you could not save. His breath caught. I will not be her echo, Ingrid said. I will not be another sorrow you carry like a chain. He stepped forward. "You are not a sorrow. You are the reason I can see the world beyond it." Before either could speak again, the door opened behind them. Mrs. Redgrave stood there, cloaked in snow. In her arms was Lillian. The child, half asleep, blinked at the firelight. Then, in a voice small and steady, she said, "Please come home." Ingrid knelt, arms open. Lillian slid into them. Sebastian watched, his heart no longer frozen. Outside, the storm howled. But inside, warmth returned. Not in the fire, but in the eyes of a child. And the silence that followed was no longer grief. It was peace. The first warmth of spring did not announce itself with grandeur, but with softness, the kind that clung to the edges of things. A breeze that no longer cut through wool. Light that lingered longer in the sky. The sound of water running again beneath the ice. At Ravenmore Hall, the change was almost imperceptible. A window cracked open to let in the scent of damp earth. Boots left at the door, wet with melted snow. A song hummed softly, drifting down a corridor where no laughter had echoed in years. The morning light that poured through the east-facing windows was not harsh or cold. It bathed the stone floors in gold, glinted against the polished banisters, and reached even the long-forgotten corners of the West Wing. For the first time since her arrival, Ingrid Harwood did not rise with heaviness in her limbs or doubt shadowing her breath. She awoke in her room, not as guest, not as burden, but as part of the house, a presence, a choice. Ingrid stood at the mirror, her hair pinned back simply, her gown of deep grey cotton modest yet fine. There was no lace at her collar, no embroidery at her cuffs, and still there was something luminous about her, something still and steady, something earned. She descended the staircase as the clock in the foyer struck 8. Waiting at the bottom was Lillian. The child held a small bundle in her arms, a folded shawl, Ingrid's own, returned with reverence. Her green eyes, brighter now, met Ingrid's without fear. "I didn't let them move it," she said, her voice clear, small but certain. Ingrid smiled. "You did very well." They walked together to the West Wing. The key waited in Mrs. Redgrave's hand, old and ornate, dangling from a velvet ribbon she had not touched in years. The housekeeper gave it to Ingrid with no ceremony, only a nod. "You'll know what to do with it." The door opened without resistance. The corridor beyond had not changed. The carpet was still soft. The dust had been banished, but the air held the hush of sacred ground. At the end, the familiar white-painted door remained, the carved rose gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Ingrid paused, then she turned the knob and stepped through. The Duchess's old chambers had been emptied. The cradle had been carried gently to the attic and blessed before it left. The walls had been painted a soft cream. New curtains, made by local seamstresses, hung open to the bright spring light. A shelf of books now lined the western wall. A pianoforte stood beneath the window, polished and tuned, its ivory keys waiting. It was no longer a mausoleum. It was a room for the living. Lillian stepped in and stood silently at the center. Sebastian arrived moments later. He wore no cravat, no gloves. His coat was open, and the light struck his face, making the grey at his temples gleam. He looked not like a duke, not like a ghost, but like a man who had finally stepped out of shadow. He looked first at the girl, then at the woman, and then he spoke. "I have stood in this room as a husband, as a father, and as a coward," he said, his voice rough with truth. "But I have never stood here as I am now, without pretense, without mourning cloaked as dignity." Ingrid did not speak. Her breath caught in her throat. Sebastian stepped forward slowly and removed a small velvet pouch from his coat. From it, he drew a ring, not elaborate, not loud. A single pearl nestled in a filigree of gold. Worn, loved, timeless. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She wore it through war, widowhood, and joy. She told me once that love is not always fire. Sometimes it is the quiet after the fire, the warmth that stays." He looked at her, and in his gaze there was no plea, only offering. "I don't want you here as a servant, nor as sacrifice," he said, "but as the woman who turned mourning into music, into voice, into something that lives. She stepped forward, and as he held the ring between them, Ingrid whispered, "Then let us live." His hands trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. Her hand trembled more. Beside them, Lillian approached the pianoforte. She climbed onto the bench with care and lifted the lid. Her small fingers rested on the keys, then pressed one. A note rang out. Clear, pure. She looked up at Ingrid. "Will you play?" Ingrid crossed the room and sat beside her. Her fingers moved across the keys with ease, drawing out a gentle melody. A hymn, remembered not from sorrow, but from solace. Lillian hummed softly, matching the tune. Sebastian stood back, arms folded, watching them both, not with distance, but with awe. Outside, the snow had melted into rivulets that rushed through the garden beds. The trees held their buds close, not ready yet to bloom, but daring to hope. Inside Ravenmore Hall, music echoed down the west wing. It was not loud, but it was alive. And for the first time in years, the house breathed. It did not mourn. It sang. The roses bloomed early that year. They lined the stone wall beside the southern garden in lush clusters of cream and soft pink, their petals catching the morning dew like old lace. Beyond them, the estate stretched in quiet harmony, its once haunted corners now filled with bird song and children's laughter. The halls no longer echoed with memory alone, but with footsteps, voices, and life too full to be contained in silence. Ravenmore had changed, but not entirely. Ingrid Greystoke stood beneath the arbor, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the sun. Her hair was streaked now with silver, and her eyes carried the weight of everything she had seen and survived, but there was light in them still, a steady flame that had not dimmed. She watched the children race across the grass, Lillian, now 16, taller than ever, her hair flying behind her like a banner of victory. Her laugh was unguarded, free. Her hands no longer clutched dolls, but books and pencils and music scores she composed in the solitude of the West Wing, now her own. Beside her ran a boy of 6, golden-haired and wild-hearted. He was barefoot, despite Ingrid's endless reminders, and he carried a wooden sword he refused to part with. Behind them came a girl, younger, slower, determined not to be left behind. Her cheeks were pink with joy. Their mother smiled. Sebastian approached quietly, his stride slower now, but just as certain. His hair had turned fully silver at the temples, and his once stern face was softer, touched by the years spent choosing peace over penance. "They've found the apple tree," he said, nodding toward the far end of the orchard. "They always do," Ingrid replied. "They claim it gives sweeter fruit than any other, though it's never been proven. Much like love." She looked at him, her heart tightening. "I still remember," she said. "The first time I crossed this threshold, I thought the house would devour me." "It tried," he said, smiling, "but you swallowed it instead." They stood in silence for a moment, the spring air wrapping around them, the past close enough to touch, but no longer sharp. Behind them, the West Wing stood open. The music chamber now served as a place of learning for village children who had no schools of their own. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the rooms filled with little shoes and eager hands, and Ingrid taught them letters while Lillian guided their music. The laughter that once seemed unimaginable now lived in the very walls. But not all echoes had been sweet. Bishop Fairfax, long stripped of his title and quietly relocated to the northern border of Derbyshire, had lived out his final years in isolation, his sermons no longer welcomed. No formal charges had ever been brought against him, but his silence had become his penance. No one mourned his passing, not even the church he once claimed to protect. Mrs. Redgrave had remained at Ravenmore until the year prior, when her knees had finally insisted on rest. She now lived with her niece in the village, visited often, and still corrected Ingrid's housekeeping with a sharp eye and unyielding affection. And Lillian, sweet, silent Lillian, had blossomed into something Ingrid never dared hope for. Her voice, once lost to grief, now taught others how to find their own. She had no desire for courtships or titles. She dreamed of opening a conservatory in Bath, one that welcomed girls from any station, so long as they had music in their hearts and enough courage to follow it. As for the children, Samuel and Eliza Greystoke, they had inherited both their father's stubbornness and their mother's quiet fire. Samuel, who could not be told anything twice without challenging it, and Eliza, who remembered every story her father whispered to her at night and repeated them back word for word days later. Ingrid sometimes wondered if her mother would have recognized the woman she had become. She hoped not. She hoped her mother would see something better. As the children tumbled into her arms, laughing and breathless, Sebastian reached for her hand. They had grown older together, not without trials, not without shadows, but never again in silence. They had learned, after everything, that love did not always heal quickly, but it healed completely. And when it did, it gave back everything time had tried to take. Later that evening, as the lanterns were lit and the children slept in their warm beds, Ingrid sat alone at the pianoforte. Her fingers moved over the keys without effort, playing a melody she had written herself, a blend of old hymns and new hopes. Sebastian stood in the doorway, watching her with the same wonder he had carried for 8 years. "I remember that tune," he said softly. She looked over her shoulder. "It has no name." "Yes, it does," he said, stepping into the light. "It's called Raven Moor." She smiled, not because of the music, but because, after everything, they were still here. And the house that once mourned now sang. Some houses are built of stone, others of silence, but Ravenmoor was built of something else entirely: grief, memory, and the quiet, steady courage it takes to begin again. Ingrid's story reminds us that the past may shape us, but it does not have to define us, that healing is never loud. That love, true love, is not always born of fireworks and declarations, but of whispered forgiveness, of glances held too long, of one hand resting lightly on another after too many years alone. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all, that sometimes the place we feared would swallow us whole becomes the place where we finally find ourselves. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment below. Let us know what moment stayed with you the longest, what moved you, surprised you, perhaps even healed a small part of you. And if you read all the way to the end, write the word Rosewood in the comments. It's our quiet way of knowing who walked with us through every echoing corridor, through every note of sorrow and grace. If you feel called to support the team behind this story, your super thanks on YouTube means more than we can say. Whatever amount you choose, know that it helps keep these tales alive, lighting a lantern for the next soul who needs them. And if you can't support us financially, your share is just as powerful. Send this story to a friend, a sister, a mother, or someone who still believes in the magic of second chances. Sometimes that's how hope spreads, one story at a time. There are more journeys waiting for you, tales of forbidden love, lost letters, and quiet heroines who rewrite their fate. I've linked them in the cards above just for you. Thank you truly for being part of this one. Until the next story finds us, may you always choose courage over silence and love over fear.